Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 29th of January, and you're watching Arirang News, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Kwon Jang-won, and it's good to have you with us. Tensions between Seoul and Tokyo remain high over the low-altitude flybys made by Japanese patrol planes near South Korean warships. While both sides agree that talks are needed, neither side is backing down their claims over who was the aggressor. We'll look at this issue further later in our programme, but first we go to Devin Whiting at the News Centre with the latest headlines. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. South Korean Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon is looking to speed up deregulation to stimulate economic growth. For one thing, the government wants to allow certain companies to go about their business without worrying about regulations, as long as they don't threaten people's lives, their security, or the environment. Our Choi Si-young has this report.
At a weekly cabinet meeting on Tuesday, Prime Minister Lee reaffirmed the government's commitment to deregulation. Two things particularly stood out at the meeting. First, companies engaged in new industries like hydrogen energy or solar panels will now be able to operate without being hindered by existing regulations, as long as their activities do not threaten citizens' life, security, or environment. The hope is that the firms will be able to take bold decisions without the burden of regulations. The government will expand this allow first, regulate later approach to other industries as it sees fit. Second, when companies question regulations they see as unfit or are in need of revision, the government will have to prove the regulations in question are needed. If the government fails to deliver a powerful defense, the regulations are likely to be revised or revoked altogether. This change comes amid criticism that companies had to follow regulations even if they don't reflect the reality of the industry they are regulating. Now that companies are able to be more vocal, they will be less burdened by outdated regulations. Prime Minister Lee and the government ministers also gave out exemptions from their preliminary government economic assessment to 23 large-scale projects. The government usually reviews the economic validity of large-scale projects receiving over $26 million in government funding. 17 cities and provinces had requested a government exemption for a total of 33 projects such as building interprovincial railways and highways, of which 23 were granted the exemptions. In giving out the exemptions, the government said it aims to promote balanced regional development and revitalize the regional economy. The 23 projects will cost about $21 billion. Nearly half of the spending is on high-speed railway and highway construction to improve traffic and logistics networks across the country. Choi Si-young, Arirang News.
Two Korean women who during World War II were sexually enslaved by the Japanese military died on Monday. Both of them very elderly. One was an extremely well-known activist who directed global attention to Japan's past atrocities against women and girls. Lee Ji-won has more.
Kim Bok-dong, a 93-year-old victim of Japan's sexual enslavement during World War II, passed away late Monday night. At the age of 14, Kim was taken to, quote, work in a factory according to Japanese soldiers. But instead, she was forced to serve as a sex slave for Japanese troops in China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Malaysia, and other places. It was only after 8 years that she could return to her homeland. In 1992, Kim started sharing her painful stories and worked as a women's human rights activist. In 1993, Kim became the first victim of Japan's sexual enslavement to stand at the World Conference on Human Rights to share her testimony. She continued her brave and bold protest against Japan's war crimes by meeting people and international groups, participating in protests, and creating funds to help girls who have been sexually abused in wars just as she was. After all these years, she was still waiting for a sincere apology from Japan.
We will continue protesting until Japan apologizes and compensates with sincerity.
Her protest against Japan will continue even after her death, as after her funeral on Friday, her coffin will be carried around Seoul, including along the streets in front of the Japanese embassy. This comes after another 93-year-old woman known to the media only by her surname Lee died Monday morning after suffering from poor health. Lee was kidnapped on her way home from work in 1942 at the age of 17. There are now only 23 South Korean victims still alive, but their wishes for legal compensation and a sincere apology from Japan are yet to come. Seoul and Tokyo agreed in 2015 to set up a foundation to help the victims, but the two sides are now working to disband it because the 2015 deal did not reflect the victims' wishes. 이지원, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in has paid tribute to the late Kim Bok-dong, writing on his Facebook page that her testimony at the UN Human Rights Committee had, quote, brought to light a hidden history and gave others the courage to face the truth. Kim was considered the most prominent Korean survivor of sexual enslavement by Japan. President Moon promised he will never forget to set history right and will fulfill his duty to the 23 survivors still living. He also praised the late Kim for not wanting to be portrayed as a victim and instead pushing for an apology for Imperial Japan's atrocities and for legal compensation. Earlier this month, President Moon had visited Kim at the hospital where she was battling cancer. South Korea's foreign ministry has urged Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono to immediately withdraw his claim that Dokdo Island belongs to Japan. The Japanese foreign minister said the islets are Japanese territory in a speech to Japan's parliament on Monday. The South Korean government issued a statement the same day saying Dokdo belongs to Korea according to history, geography, and international law. Seoul again stressed that the future of Korea-Japan relations needs to be based on a humble attitude of facing up to history. In other news, former South Korean Prime Minister Hwang KyoAhn has announced that he'll be running for the chairmanship of the main opposition Liberty Korea Party at its national convention set for February 27th. Announcing his candidacy on Tuesday, Hwang said he wants to devote his whole life to saving the country and the people. He promised to revive the South Korean economy and lead the party to victory in next year's parliamentary elections. The former prime minister also stressed that he wants to scrap the current government's income-led growth policy and its nuclear-free energy policy, which, he said, are destroying the country. The party's Board of Elections acknowledged his candidacy the same day. There had been a dispute within the party over whether he's qualified to run, having joined the party just this month. The U.S. Justice Department has filed federal charges against Chinese telecoms giant Huawei and its CFO, Meng Wanzhou, who's under arrest in Canada. The U.S. accuses Huawei of stealing intellectual property, violating sanctions against Iran, breaking confidentiality agreements, and other crimes. Those charges were filed just 2 days before Washington and Beijing are scheduled for their next round of trade talks. Noah reports.
Monday's move could potentially complicate efforts by Washington and Beijing to negotiate an end to their trade war. It could also complicate matters between China and Canada, as the Justice Department also charged Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, who was arrested in Canada last month on a U.S. request. Huawei was charged with accusations of bank and wire fraud, as well as trying to steal trade secrets from rival T-Mobile and giving incentives to employees to carry out such illicit activities. Others include working to skirt U.S. sanctions on Iran. Washington claims Huawei misled the U.S. and a global bank about its relationship with an Iranian affiliate.
By claiming that Skycom was a separate company and not an affiliate of Huawei, which it actually controlled, Huawei allegedly asserted that all of its Iranian business was in compliance with the American sanctions. These alleged false claims led banks to do business with the company and therefore to unknowingly violate our laws.
Both Huawei and Ms. Meng deny the allegations. Washington's crackdown on Huawei began about 10 years ago amid concerns the Chinese government could use the firm's technology for spying. Huawei has insisted it is not under government control. U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, meanwhile, insisted Monday's indictment was separate from ongoing trade talks with Beijing. President Trump will meet Chinese Vice Premier Liu He this week in Washington to try to resolve the trade dispute. Noah, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
The dispute between Seoul and Tokyo has carried on for several weeks now over the low-altitude flybys performed by Japanese planes near South Korean warships. According to Korea's Defense Ministry, the issue could be put on the table at this year's Western Pacific Naval Symposium, a forum for countries in the region to discuss naval affairs. Kang Young-woo has more.
On Monday, Seoul's Ministry of National Defense said the dispute over the Japanese warplanes' aggressive low-altitude flybys could be discussed in working-level talks at the Western Pacific Naval Symposium set for April.
If there's a need to talk about the flybys at the working-level meeting, then it should be discussed so regulations and guidelines can be established to prevent similar incidents in the future.
If the matter does come up at the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, then a guideline for evaluating the flights could be the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea, or CUES. The CUES was signed at the symposium in 2014 by 21 Pacific nations, including South Korea, the US, and Japan, to prevent tensions escalating between different countries' militaries at sea. Meanwhile, Japan is reportedly rethinking its plan to send warships to an international maritime exercise that will begin in waters off the Korean peninsula from late April to early May. But Seoul's Defense Ministry says a final decision on which countries will join the exercise and on what scale will be made in working-level talks between the participating countries, likely to take place at the end of February. Tensions seemed to rise late last week also, when the South Korean Defense Minister paid a visit on Saturday to Naval Operations Command in Busan, following a trip by the Japanese Defense Minister the day before to a naval airbase near Yokohama. Experts have suggested that Japan could be using the military dispute to increase public support for the Abe administration. The military spat erupted back in December when Japan claimed that a South Korean warship used its targeting radar on a Japanese plane, something Seoul says there's no evidence for. And last week, Seoul's Defense Ministry released photographs of a Japanese warplane conducting a low-altitude flyby. Kang Young-woo, Arirang News.
For more, joining us today, we have with us Dr Will Jung, a research fellow from the Sejong Institute. Welcome back to the show today.
My pleasure.
So the original incident between South Korea and Japan took place in late December last year, and you would have thought that this kind of incident would have been resolved by now, but instead it's continued to escalate into what can only be described as a diplomatic incident. Why are the two sides continuing to argue over this, and why does there seem to be that there's no resolution in sight?
I think this case shows that complexity of the relations between Korea and Japan. Since now everyone is talking about the differences between Korea and Japan, let's talk about some similarities. Korea and Japan are the fully developed democracies in Northeast Asia with well-developed economies, and they are the two main allies of the United States in the region. And we have also same threat from the North Korea, and we also facing the challenges from China. However, we have these historical issues that will never reconcile the differences between two countries. So I think that it's not only that these military issues, but all the issues are inevitably linked to the historical issues in the earlier part of 20th century. That is why everyone is interpreting the issue not only as a military issues, but also to the history and the political issues. That is why it's very difficult to reach a solution among two countries' working level officials.
It seems that Japan was the one who accused South Korea of the warship radar lock onto the Japanese warplane, and since then Japan has continued to make accusations against the South Korea, and it seems to be inflaming what's already a sensitive issue. There's been some interpretation that this is actually the Abe administration deliberately taking this hardline stance to boost their approval ratings as the dispute plays well with their conservative base within Japan. And perhaps that we are seeing some side of that working, because Abe's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's approval rating for this month jumped up 6% to over 50 percentage points now, to 50% now, which some have said is because of this dispute. Do you think that could be the reason why this issue continues to be unresolved?
Every politician wants to take advantage of every issues that might be working favorable to him. However, in this issue, that it is evident that South Korean naval ship was on a mission for the humanitarian rescue of the North Korean ships. And while South Korean naval ships are on the sea in the rescue mission, that there's a low altitude flybys by the Japanese plane. And Japanese self-defense force now argue that South Korean warship uses that missile targeting radar against the Japanese airplane. And South Korean military denied it. So I think it's a simple matter. There's nothing much that you can take advantage in terms of the politics. However, in Japan, Korea-Japan issues also a very hot debated issue among the public, like in Korea. So I think Prime Minister Abe, whether he won it or he did not want, but this issue is the very hotly debated issues in Japan. That is why this kind of issue helped him in his approval ratings. But we don't know whether he intentionally used this issue for his approval ratings.
So the natural next question becomes, how does this issue become resolved? How do we end this dispute? Because either side don't seem to be taking any steps to back down. There has been some question that the US might get involved because, as you said, the US is South Korea and Japan's closest ally. But so far, there's been no word from the US. What do you think, Washington, how do you think they're viewing this situation?
So the first thing that two countries need to do is not to escalate anymore. So now we heard all the news that Japanese government was talking about the Dokdo is their territory, and also they are indicating that they are pulling off from the military exchange between Korea and Japan. So that's unnecessary escalation from the incident happened in December. So if two countries agree to not to escalate anymore, then as time goes by, then they can reach some kind of solutions to technically and scientifically solve the issues. And if there's any misunderstanding of any sort of kind, then two countries can resolve it. So I think that the US involvement in this case is first not to escalate the situation anymore, so the two countries can have some kind of meetings with a much cooler mind than now.
And perhaps Washington is already taking steps because the US ambassador to South Korea, Harry Harris, met with the South Korea's defense minister on Monday, and he's of course an ex-Navy man. Although the details of their conversation was not disclosed, they are believed to have discussed this incident. Do you think Washington will want to get involved in this, though?
Washington will not publicly get involved in this situation because Washington knows that this is not only the military issues, but also the historical and political issue between Korea and Japan. So it's not a winning issue for United States to get involved in the first place. But so I think that the U.S. as an important ally of two countries, their first request would be not to escalate more, and the two countries need to sit down and solve this problem reasonably. So I think that there might be some unofficial request or suggestion from the U.S. government, but there will be no public statement from the United States to get involved in this situation.
And finally, do you think it can be resolved quickly, or do you think this is going to be further drawn out over the next few weeks or even months, maybe?
If the countries agree that it's not in their interest to escalate anymore, then the situation is going to calm down soon. But the technical resolution of the situation in December, whether South Korean naval ship really use its missile targeting radar against the Japanese airplane, can be resolved in the future. But since Japanese government is refusing to have a talk about this issue right now, then I think it'll take more time to get resolved this issue. But the first more important thing is that not to escalate anymore in diplomatic area.
Now let's shift focus because Ambassador Harry Harris, he not only met with the defense minister, but he also met with the foreign minister Kang Kyung-hwa, and there was it's unclear exactly what they talked about again, but with both ministers, Harris is expected to have talked about the current negotiations that are going on between South Korea and the US over hosting US forces in South Korea. Now that the US government shutdown is over, there are expectations that the negotiations over this issue will continue. How do you see the current situation?
So the problem now is that there are differences in how much South Korean government should contribute for the cost sharing. So far, there's South Korean government and the United States agreed to pay in lump sum in every year, which is near the billion US dollars. However, now with the President Trump assuming the office in 2017, that one of his pledges was that he's going to have U.S. allies to pay more for the so-called services that U.S. is provide to its allies. However, having the relationship as allies is not a service provided by one country to the other. But the problem is that United States has much bigger power than any other of its allies. So now I think that we might have to pay more than the previous deals. However, the U.S. request about having the negotiation every year would be changed because since South Korean government is paying lump sum to the cost sharing, there is no need to negotiate every year. So I think that two countries might end up with paying more from Korean side, and U.S. is going to agree that the negotiation is by every 3 years or 5 years, as in the previous deals.
One more topic I'd like to get your thoughts on before we go as well. So let's go back to the Japanese Prime Minister Abe, who gave his annual policy speech on Monday, where he openly seemed to court North Korea to engage in talks and said he would act decisively to make it happen. Now, Japan is a member of the six-party talks that agreed with the original denuclearization agreement for North Korea previously, but their role seems to have been sidelined somewhat in recent years. What do you think Abe wants by engaging with Kim Jong-un, and do you think North Korea will respond?
So I think there are two main reasons why Prime Minister Abe was very active on these issues. First thing is that because of the security issues, Japanese people are very concerned about North Korea's missile capability, which already had an ability to reach in Japan with its missiles and nuclear weapons. So I think that as a Japanese political leader, that Prime Minister Abe has to show that he's very closely monitoring the situation and Japan is involved in resolving North Korean nuclear issues. Second, Japan has very keen eye on its abduct issues when it comes to its negotiation with North Korea. So Japan has security issues. At the same time, Japan has these abduct issues in the past. So as a Japanese prime minister, he needs to show that he's taking care of this issue as well. So I think that is why Japanese government and the prime minister himself is very actively seeking an opportunity to take part in the negotiation with North Korea.
But what is North Korea's stance on Japan? I mean, do they also want to engage with Japan, or will Japan continue to be framed as North Korea's enemy as such?
In the past, Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, already met Prime Minister Go Izumi before to solve the abduct issues. However, as there was no progress, two countries' relations got cold, and also North Korea's nuclear development made it very difficult for two countries to reconcile its differences. So I think that if North Korea's nuclear issues has shown some progress with the United States and South Korea, there might be some room for Japan and North Korea can improve their relations.
Do you think there is still this possibility of Prime Minister Abe maybe even meeting with Kim Jong-un, holding a summit at some point?
I think that if conditions met, there's a much more willingness from Japanese side, and there's also some kind of willingness from North Korea, because now North Korea can use this reparation money from Japan for its economy. So I think there's a mutual interest for the two countries' leaders to meet in the future.
That's what we have time for. Thank you for coming in today and sharing us your insights.
Thank you.
That brings another show to a close. I'll be back tomorrow with more talk on the day's top stories. But do stay tuned to Arirang for our later newscasts for all the latest updates. Thank you for watching and hope you can join us again next time. Goodbye.